Hi and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Autumn Hamry. I am the field marketing manager here at Hyperproof and I'll be getting us started. Today we'll join a panel of experts to discuss how organizations can transform from ad hoc audit processes to a proactive approach in acing audits. Our speakers will discuss the nuances of continuous monitoring, strategies for implementation, and the future landscape of audit and compliance. A bit of housekeeping points before we get started. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, we welcome you to enter them into the Q&A box for our speakers to answer after the presentation. If you are having any problems with audio or visuals during the event, please try leaving the presentation and re-entering. If this doesn't work, please let us know you're having trouble in the Q&A box. The event is being recorded and will be available on demand on our Bright Talk channel after the event ends. And lastly, attendees will receive an email with a link to the on-demand event after the webinar airs. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bill Deller, Shareholder IT Risk Advisory at Schneider Downs, Jason Lipschultz, Principal at BDO, Mark Bradford, Vice President at Investor Tools, and Kane McLattery, Hyperproof's Field CISO. Take it away, team.
Thanks, Autumn, for the introduction. I'm just going to change the layout here so you can get a little sense of who's on. And there's not going to be a lot of slides. I know Bill is having a challenge here and there getting connected, but briefly, I'm Kane. I'm the field CISO for Hyperproof. I've been doing this for over 25 years now. Former A&D, that's aerospace and defense CISO, former executive advisor, Fortune 500 Global 1000 companies, and author of the forthcoming GRC maturity model, which will be released by Hyperproof in August. At a date and location to be determined, but check our website at hyperproof.io and you'll see it. With that, let's go to my friend Mark. Mark, can you introduce yourself? You and I were at SANS, what was that, earlier this year?
Yes, that was a good time. Thank you, Kane. I'm Mark Bradford. I'm the Vice President of Risk and Compliance at Investor Tools. We are a software developer and we cater to a very highly regulated industry and makes risk and compliance that much more fun.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. And now let's go to Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Kane. Good to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity. Jason Lipschultz, Principal with BDO, and been with BDO just under 6 years and doing IT risk and compliance work for 20 when SOC reports were SAS 70s, and worked on the very first SOC 2 report when at that time it was a highly discretionary endeavor to now we see it as really a table stakes component of risk and compliance amongst a number of other things. And then most recently, the advent and clear benefit of leveraging software like Hyperproof to really enable that and drive that forward. And really excited to say we actually just announced our strategic relationship with Hyperproof just last week. So really excited to be here and for the relationship and to help everyone navigate this world.
Fantastic. Well, I'm glad that you're here as well. And when Bill's computer decides to cooperate, if it decides to cooperate, is there a SE or a security person in the house? Because Bill's computer's having some problems. But with that, we're going to move forward. When Bill joins us, he can. And I'm just going to quickly go through some slides just to kind of orient the audience to today's topic, and then we'll get into our discussion. So we're going to be talking about continuous monitoring of controls. We're going to get started with continuous monitoring, and then we're going to take a look towards the future of this space. And the reason that we're here today really is, oh, hello, that was exciting. Let's go. You just can't plan for things like this where your webinar decides to have some fun with you. There we go. Let's try that again. So the reason we're here today is you want to learn how to help your organization move from an ad hoc audit process to a proactive approach to really ace your audits. And so today we're going to be hearing from our industry experts on which steps you can take to streamline your audits year round. And our first topic, like I said, those slides are very quick, is around what is continuous monitoring of controls. And I will now bring up our panelists. Here we go. Nope. Let's bring up the panelists, actually. This is why they don't usually let me run these things. So let's talk about continuous monitoring. I'm going to put this first question to Jason. And for the audience, please, can you please explain the concept of continuous monitoring of control operations, and then how it's implemented at your clients' firms so it's a little more actionable and the audience can understand really what we're talking about?
Absolutely. Continuous monitoring, when I think about the question, I also think about why do we or really should we be doing compliance work? And certainly there's an underlying requirement to a contractual requirement in many cases where a company is issuing a SOC report or doing ISO certification or what have you because it's in a contract or it's being asked for by a prospect. But really, at the end of the day, what do these compliance frameworks ask companies to do? We really think that they're asking companies to do what a good business should be doing anyways. And really, the audit report certification is just the output of that. And so continuous monitoring is an evolution really to say, hey, instead of just doing the audit because you're asked, to do it, and then instead of, okay, fine, well, it's a good thing to have, instead of, well, just doing it once or twice a year, gosh, these are really good things that we should be doing. Right, we should be looking at who has access and changes to the system, right? So these are, especially if we're in a technology field or serving highly regulated customers. And so how do we do that more regularly? And that's really where the concept of continuous monitoring, has come from. And so, it started with sort of a manual thought that's evolved into leveraging technology where you can use software to automate a number of controls, or at least automate a portion of controls, right? Even if part of it has to be reviewed. There's a number of repeatable steps in controls, whether it's looking at configurations or looking at access or what have you. And that's really, the why behind we're doing this, and what it really is what it sounds like, looking at controls on a regular, if not real-time basis. That's really what continuous monitoring is. And what does it look like at companies? Well, ideally, it looks like leveraging a software, platform like a Hyperproof, where you can essentially connect to source systems, the places where you would otherwise get the evidence anyways, and have that data either available to you real time or pulled for you, on a regular basis, depending on what the actual control is. And then use that throughout the period, which not only suffices the audit, but it also would help you if you have an internal audit function. And this also speaks to some of the aspects of SOC 2. You'll see I refer to that quite a bit because that framework is really overarching. And the CC4 component in there is really all about internal controls monitoring. And I think if you do it right, you're doing this type of continuous monitoring.
Well, I wonder, you gave us a lot to unpack there. And Mark, Jason talked a lot about continuous monitoring of controls, but also highly regulated industries. And I know you do something of that, but you're coming at this from a different perspective because you don't have a lot of clients. Rather, you are one of those, well, you represent one of those companies that's audited probably more than you'd like to be, possibly more frequently than anybody should be. What's this mean to you for continuous monitoring of controls operations and how you've went about implementing it? Because I think you also use Hyperproof, right?
We do. And it's actually been a great benefit to us for a lot of the reasons that Jason was mentioning. Control design, we went through an exercise a while back where we put everything on the table and redesigned because the manual approach to things is just not sustainable. And the growth, the scale that we're reaching, even as a small business in a very specific industry, the landscape keeps changing. And the controls have to be evergreen, and they have, or at least have to be adaptable. And so, what it looks like for us is it depends on the type of control. In some respects, a technical control is very much easier to monitor continuously. You can put some automated tests in place and have the system just throw up alerts and draw your attention to the things that bubble up. The more difficult things are around policies, let's say. You've got policy controls in place. How do you automate that? With tools like Hyperproof, you do have some very beneficial tools to draw your attention to things, to make sure things stay fresh, make sure that your attention is on the things where you get the most bang for your buck, so to speak.
Okay, all right. So thinking about that, then I'm thinking of our own journey with FedRAMP Moderate, which has driven at least one of my colleagues to drink beer on YouTube, and for him to drag me along into that. And it has a term in there, CONMON, continuous monitoring. And I want to ask this of I don't know. Let's go with Mark first. So how FedRAMP it's a framework. It's a framework that's fairly detailed as well. It's a cybersecurity framework. And I'm bringing this up because may have a lot of cybersecurity professionals on this call, and they might be wondering, well, what do you mean? And like, how do I pick this apart? So, Mark, how do you differentiate between frameworks like FedRAMP or some other frameworks that require continuous monitoring versus those where it's, I don't know, it's a nice to have thing, but it's not actually a requirement of the framework?
That's an interesting question, because I look at it and say, if the framework doesn't require it, I don't really care. It benefits me to do it. If the framework lays out requirements for me that I need to be able to go to an auditor at some point and provide, artifacts, provide proof that we're doing what we say we're doing, that automation, because we're a small business and I've got a small team, we need to have a system in place that's going to be doing the work for us. So if you've got the sampling criteria for your testing, setting up a system to go through and verify that for you wherever possible, it only gains me efficiency. And there's obviously many benefits to efficiency, whether it's cost, whether it's staffing. Basically, I don't look at the frameworks with that being a criteria. I look at it as, this is something I'm going to do anyway.
Okay, well, I want to pivot this to an auditor. Jason, I think that's fair to say what you do or what you lead teams that go do. What's this mean to you when continuous monitoring isn't in the framework? Is it just a nice to have in your audit practices, or is there a material benefit to either you as the auditor or to your clients in having continuous monitoring of controls?
The good question. The simple answer is no. The more nuanced answer is that organizations are going to have an inflection point as to when they need to do it, right? Just like Excel is fine until it's not. Doing ad hoc auditing is fine until it's not, for really similar reasons. If you're doing one report or one cert, maybe it's fine, right? Like, let's not fix what's not broken, right? But if you have multiple requirements, and by the way, it may or may not be because you're a huge enterprise, right? I mean, Mark, you have a growing company, not a huge growing enterprise. However, you're in or serving highly regulated industries, and this is critical to your business. And so, without it, then it really will impact the growth of your business. And so I'm sure you guys realize this, and a number of my clients realize that, we need to be doing these things, not just because a framework says so or a client asks for it, but because we see benefit in improving our actual processes and actually improving the experience of our customers and delivering the service, right? And because these controls either directly or indirectly impact the end user or the customer. And so, the more you're doing here, the more it's necessary, right? So you do see it in, well, I wouldn't necessarily say continuous monitoring is explicitly stated in SOC 2. It's touched on, at least on the periphery.
So it's not just a nice to have. We're not just doing work for the sake of work. There actually is some value there.
Correct. Although I wouldn't say, automatically every company should do it either. But I think I don't think I know, a lot more companies need to do it over the last even just 3 years than needed to prior.
Fair enough. And I also want to remind our audience, because this is a live broadcast, if you're watching this and you've got a question, either for somebody who is it an insanely, Mark, is that a phrase? Is that fair? Insanely regulated, like regularly regulated, way too heavily regulated? I have some feels. Or if you want to ask an auditor a question, remember, you have to ask them the question of hypothetically, kind of the same way you talk to your counsel. Do drop those in the chat. And I want to go back to something that Jason had just said there, but I want to put it to Bill. And I want to talk about how you build a business case for this. Like, how do you substantiate that you need to have this? And Jason talked on a little bit, Bill. Jason talked on a little bit, Mark. But how do you really build a business case to get other executives to say, hey, we should do this. We should have some kind of continuous monitoring of controls instead of just doing Excel because it's satisfactory for now. Like, how do you move the needle forward?
And this one's to me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. state the obvious, I think budget is a big driver. You've got choices. You either add bodies to scale up a program, but that's a good way to get the wrong kind of attention. If you can ask to apply a fraction of the budget that would be required to staff up the department and put that towards the right tools where automation can work in your favor, then you can improve the efficacy of your program and ultimately the maturity of your program, and save the money, or save the organization money. Sorry. I think when you can speak in terms that the COO can understand, for example, you're talking about budget. Putting it in the framework of look, we're driving efficiency, we're adding value, and comparing that to what is an alternative way to add that value. Now we're going to choose the least expensive path. That also happens to be the choice that I wanted you to pick. But at the risk of sounding a little manipulative, that's really, I've found a very good way to couch the conversations, to say, look, I've explored it this way and I've explored it that way. Mm-hmm. This is the way I prefer. And by the way, this is probably the least expensive option for us. So that's top of mind where I would go.
So you're really framing it, though, in business terms. You're not talking about technologies. I didn't hear any use of buzzwords there, Mark.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I love that lines and covers actually with one of our survey. Every year, Hyperproof does a IT benchmark survey, and in 2024, we found that the organizations that had manual processes that were doing their audits the way that Jason's probably seen, where you pick up the rock and everything scuttles out in the light, and you go, wow, there's just a lot of Excel here. What those companies were doing was they were trying to hire a lot of people because they don't recognize that there is automation in this space, or they're resistant to it. They think that they can somehow hire their way out of this problem, which I think becomes detrimental to entering new business markets, especially, let alone sustaining them. This is kind of a Mark question, but Jason, do you have anything on this one too about building? This was about building that business case from your perspective. Have you ever had to help a client do that or justify it?
Giving perspective too, yes, and it also kind of goes back to why do we enjoy doing this type of work? Because sure, it's audit and compliance, but it's because that this work is being done for our clients' customers, and it's really critical to their business. Right? There's revenue directly tied to it. And it's really about protecting and growing the business. And so it's a little more interesting type of conversation than perhaps other areas. Not to say, other work isn't as interesting, but we just find this really kind of fascinating to see how this has grown and evolved. And ultimately, I think tying this compliance work to the business objectives, like what is the objective of the business? We want to grow. We want to grow how? Okay, so this is being tied to customers in that area, and the fact that you're seeing a lot of requests in new proposals, new pitches around this sort of thing, I think will really get the attention of executives to say, all right, we really need to do something. The question is, what is that something, right? And you need people and you need technology, and I think that's really important. Neither will solve it on its own. And so, for decades, it was just people. And then we've seen some organizations just try and switch and do entirely technology, and that's not going to work either. And I think that is the beauty of Hyperproof, really understanding and appreciating the value of the technology is to really amplify the audit, experience. But more than that, help a company really manage its controls on a regular basis. So I think really tying it to your corporate objectives and the growth of the company is going to resonate.
So you raise a really good point there about some companies over-rotating into manual processes or all technology processes. And I have a follow-up question, Jason, because you bring a lot of experience to this. And I want to talk about those misconceptions or those gaps, things you've seen that where your clients you've looked at and you've gone, wow, who hurt you? How did you come up with this conclusion that this would be a good way to monitor your control efficacy? Do you have any stories you can share with the audience, and redact the names, of course?
Well, I think, it's kind of thinking about it too simplistically, right? Thinking that, okay, we can just come up with a predefined set of controls and produce some sort of evidence and press a couple buttons, and then out comes the reporter certification. It's not. Yeah, exactly. It's not.
You're describing every first-time CISO's job. Like they
Yeah,
think, oh, I'm
it's
just going
not.
to do NIST 853 and it'll be great.
Right. And I'm not saying it has to be complicated or extremely expensive either, but I'm just saying, you're going to do it, you got to do it right. And so the reality is that the technology can and should leverage or help you enable, right? There are a lot of manual, repetitive tasks that would otherwise be done in an audit process, whether it's, getting a screen print of password settings or looking at encryption or multi-factor authentication. Those things just live somewhere. There's no reason anyone should be manually, asking for these things all the time, constantly, right? Instead, being able to not just get access to them, but then see if they changed and then do something about it, right? But that's the then do something about it piece, right? There always is going to be and should be some level of human, interaction here, right? In doing the audit and even in preparing the audit report itself and making sure that, the description is really thoughtful and beneficial. And so it's really where we've seen customers just oversimplifying, and then, their customers kind of realize and see that. And then, a more astute reader may realize, hey, these controls really aren't what we're looking for, right? Change management is always a really good example, right? It's fine to say, hey, those who have access to development are appropriate and those who have access to production are appropriate. That's important, of course. However, is that really addressing the risk that, only authorized changes are made, right? And there's multiple ways to do that, right? Is it, separating the access? Is it monitoring changes, what have you? And so it's just, you don't have to overcomplicate, but you shouldn't oversimplify either.
I think those are some great points. And I'll also, when you were talking, I was thinking of controls that you can't test. And
Yeah.
I've seen these before. You've seen these before, Mark. I'm sure you've seen these before, where it really looks good on paper, but there's no way to actually verify that the control exists or is working. And those are always kind of the spooky controls where you go, well, feel like we can't do vibes for controls, not when it comes to control testing. Mark, anything you've seen that's really been a gap in maybe in former organizations you've been at around monitoring of control effectiveness?
Yeah, I don't know if this necessarily qualifies as a gap, but I look at, particularly these days, the regulatory environment. The landscape is changing so quickly. It seems to be accelerating, and if you don't have good monitoring of your exposure to laws and regulations, then you can quickly develop gaps where your controls are no longer effective, and you could get yourself into trouble. And that is something that I think has been true, but I think it's increasingly true in my opinion, and maybe you guys view it differently, but from my perspective, it just seems that the landscape is accelerating down this path, and it's changing so quickly. If you don't have some sort of automation in place, it's going to leave you behind.
I think it's more than just that. I think in our new post-Chevron Loper-Bright world, ultimately there are regulatory controls out there that may not be enforceable and may be struck down by enterprising litigants in the near future. And I think what organizations may find is, we've all heard the apocryphal tale of the person who makes the meatloaf in the oven and then they cut off the four sides of the meatloaf, and the reason why is that their grandmother's pan never fit that meatloaf. And we have these things that we do that don't make sense because they don't exist in our modern world, and I fully expect that future jurisprudence is going to remove some regulatory requirements where we might have a control that has absolutely no, it doesn't add a material benefit, and perhaps it actually is duplicative. And we're just doing it because some regulator somewhere said, hey, y'all should go do that, and you're doing it. So I think that might be the other part of that, Mark, where, not only is somebody like Jen Easterly, who I love, and I think she's doing great things, but at the same time has said she wants the regulatory changes to come faster from CISA. I think we also may see the inverse of that, where we start to see things fall off, ultimately.
Yeah, both sides of the same coin, in my opinion. You've got change, either change for or change against. We have to be aware.
Definitely.
Yeah, and to that point, asking the question why is really important. And we'll ask that question, even if it means maybe one less project for us. We'd rather be helpful and we look at things long term, right? So, whether it's a SOC report or more specifically, if someone's asking about high trust or SOC for cyber, we'll say, tell us more why, because those are not small feats. If there's a business case there, then let's do it. We'll help you through it. However, we got to ask the question why, and we've definitely seen sort of the pendulum swing from things being highly hey, Bill's here, all right, to from being highly discretionary to all right, now companies are doing anything customers ask for. Now I think everyone realizing that, well, that takes quite a lot of time. And is that really actually, to your point, Kane, like addressing the risk we're looking to address? Maybe we need to take a step back here, and we advise companies to really think about what is your story, what is the risk that your customers should care about, and how are you addressing that? And not just the reports or certifications, but more than that, the continuous monitoring, the technology that you're using.
Fantastic. And seeing how, Bill, you've just joined us midstream, we're going to just drop you into the fire. We have a question from the audience, and I want to thank the audience for dropping questions. Again, this is a live event, so please do put these in the chat. And the question to you, Bill, is when you prioritize controls to continuously monitor, what strategies do you use? And do you prioritize controls that were more challenging to meet in an environment, a manual environment, or some other criteria?
Yeah, good question. And just making sure you can hear me okay?
Absolutely, 100%.
Awesome. Still my wife's MacBook, so glad that works as opposed to my company issued PC. But when it comes to prioritizing the controls that you would perform continuous monitoring or automation for, I think it makes the most sense to align it with your sort of risk quantification process so you can get the most bang for your buck, right? I'm not sure what we talked about thus far, but a lot of this should start with some level of risk assessment. Mm-hmm. Aligning with that risk assessment so that you can achieve the highest level of risk mitigation would be the way that I would prioritize.
Fantastic, thank you, Bill. And as we go to our next topic, I love your sign in the background that says "Eat more tacos." Today is Tuesday, and you've already planned out my meals for me tonight. So for our second topic, we're going to talk about how to get started with continuous monitoring of controls. And for this one, Jason, I'm going to give this one to you about advising organizations. So how, because you talked a lot about implementing continuous monitoring. What are the first steps you'd recommend that organizations take, and if they haven't got started at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'd love to get everyone else's perspectives. I'm sure, Mark, you've been living this, and Bill advising clients as well. So the first thing I would say is it probably doesn't start immediately with the technology. This sort of like reminds me, because I play a little guitar, like what comes first, the music or the lyrics? The lyrics or the music? But I think in this case, it really comes down to having a sound suite of controls, control set, because that's ultimately what we're going to be continuously monitoring, right? But how do those get generated? Those get generated through or represent business processes that ultimately are put in place, as Bill mentioned, to address risk. So you have a risk assessment, understand what are the key risks to our business, what are the processes, and then controls in place to address those risks. And if you're in an environment where you've got multiple products or business units that are under regulatory or compliance requirements and issuing multiple reports and certifications, then you may come from a world where you have multiple potentially disparate control sets. And so I think the first step is really to understand inventory. What do I have? What's in scope? What are the processes and controls? And then identifying some of the lower hanging fruit to start, ultimately trying to centralize your controls so that wherever you can truly test once and report many, and then leverage technology to really take that up to the next step and automate what you might be otherwise doing manually. So I'm talking through potentially multi-year journey in like a minute here.
It's definitely not a short one, but I see our other panelists are nodding.
Yeah.
I want to pop this one over to, I don't know, Bill's still getting caught up to what we've been talking about so far. Again, on implementing continuous monitoring, is there anything that Jason said that he missed or that you would do differently as a different approach for when you're just getting started?
No, I think you nailed it, Jason. Taking a more comprehensive and holistic approach initially, it's going to save a lot of time down the road, right? Lumping in all the controls and frameworks that could come into play so that you're not duplicating efforts, and you can assess once and then extrapolate that and provide it out as applicable to the frameworks that are relevant to you, right? But yeah, the baby steps is starting with the risk assessment in my mind, right? So that you're addressing the things that matter, and you can prioritize immediately and ultimately down the line as you start to satisfy some of those low-hanging fruit.
Fantastic. Anything else to add on this one, Mark?
Yeah, maybe it's implied, but I would say, stepping back or looking at it from a slightly higher perspective, getting the right stakeholders at the table early on, and you've got an opportunity here to look and say, to your point earlier, Kane, have we been doing this all along because this is how we've always done it, or are there changes that we can make now as we begin to look towards the future of how we can do this better? So taking the opportunity to go sit down with department heads, the people the control owners, getting input from them and say, if you could have done this differently, how would you have done it? You do have an opportunity to improve more than just the automation at this point.
All right, and I want to keep on you for this next one, Mark, because you get to deal with a lot of audits and you get to deal with reporting on those. And I want to talk about reporting the effectiveness of that. So what are the key metrics or key indicators or KPIs even that organizations should be tracking to measure the effectiveness of their controls through that continuous monitoring process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think an obvious one is failure rate. Whatever tool you're using, the automation should have a threshold that allows you to throw alerts whenever a failure rate crosses that line. Again, it's supposed to be working for you, not against you. So giving you early warning on things it gives you that opportunity to get out in front of it rather than having to wait until you're sitting with an auditor and having to explain why those things failed. In your control documentation, you should be indicating what this threshold is and what the response should be, who's responsible, potential consequences for the failure. So all this stuff, the planning part up front when you're designing out your control document, obviously is key here. Effectiveness in many cases is a measure of how well you stay on the correct side of the failure threshold, is the way I think of it.
All right, so the failure threshold there. I don't know, Jason or Bill, what are the other things that organizations should be really starting to track the effectiveness of their monitoring of continuous monitoring, I should say, of their controls?
That's a good question. When I think of tracking, I think of the results for sure, as Mark was talking about, but I also might think about what is sort of the connection between the controls and reports and customer requirements and requests, right? And, is this, causing a benefit or impacting, the ability for the company to grow and attract new business? And, perhaps if there are ways that processes are automated, is that, saving time? Is that helping to, sort of improve certain service level type metrics? Those might be some other things I might think about.
All right. Anything else to add on that one, Bill?
Yeah, I thought Jason was going down the same line here, but the thing that I would add to that is testing the integrity and accuracy of the continuous monitoring connections, if you will, right? It's not uncommon for those connections or integrations to render false positives or lack integrity altogether. And therefore, that's a big part of when we're performing SOC 2, ISO, et cetera, audits, that we have to actually test those connections and integrations to ensure that they're sound in nature. That all rolls up into what we refer to as completeness and accuracy, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to get the queries, we have to perform the application controls, if you will, to ensure that those connections are sound for every sort of manual or rather automated control that we're testing.
Fantastic. Well, I want to keep this next question with you then, because you're starting to describe some kind of, to me, like things you'd look for if you were looking to start moving away from a manual process and you were looking to automate this stuff. So from your perspective, then we'll kick this one around the room. What are the features or functions, Bill, that you think organizations should be looking for in an automated compliance platform to really drive those business value outcomes?
Yeah, then I'll dial right back to that previous statement. I see where you were going with that, Kane, and it's the integrations is the number one thing. Is the easiest thing to get started and to understand. We like to say that if you can connect with the cloud service provider, identity access management, and maybe an HRIS system, you're getting the 80/20 effectiveness that the whole solution does. Where I see platforms differentiate their services is the ability to implement and develop custom automations and integrations, right? A lot of this market's becoming pretty saturated, so some of those out-of-the-box integrations are becoming more common, but the great ones have the ability to develop and design unique automations and connections to systems that aren't as or large scale.
Okay, so that ability to really have some out-of-the-box integrations then, and to develop additional ones or do additional integrations is required. Mark, Jason, what else should people be looking for automated compliance and automated control testing and monitoring?
Well, I think it may depend a little bit on your program. If you're in a dedicated compliance department, your needs might be a little different than an integrated GRC department like we run, where you've got to cover governance, risk management, and compliance modules. And some examples. I mean, you've got the automation, obviously, but automation around policy management could be very different from operational risk management controls, or compliance and audit controls. So making sure that it's feature rich, making sure that you've looked at it beyond just the top level. You do have to get a little bit into the weeds to understand your needs and ensure that the system has enough to cover the broader spectrum. But it's specifically, I would say, a couple of things that don't always get brought up in conversations, in my opinion, are like calendaring, being able to manage your time, not just have the automation, but also have it automatically remind you to come back and either perform a task or review a document or that type of thing. So sometimes it's, the focus can be very much on the gears, and you really need to ensure that you've got, enough windows. Another thing might be, robust and secure document management. A lot of these systems now are in the cloud. So if you're going to be using this as your compliance system of record, you want to ensure that their security is top notch as well. I'm sure there's more. Maybe Jason has some more to add.
Yeah,
I want to say I love the point that you brought up, Mark, of manual processes and reminders for those, because otherwise, if you're trying to determine, like if you're in charge of GRC and you don't have that visibility into people's workloads or their processing, you don't actually have that sense that, oh, this is being done well, or it's being done at all. And then come time for an audit, it's a bit of a panic attack as you try to figure out, like, where are all my artifacts and like who's falling behind. So I love that you brought that one in there, because controls are not just all automated. Jason, what else have you seen here for automated compliance?
To that end, right, you can automate, I think, just about everything. Not everything, most things, but you should be able to leverage just about everything. So the workflows essentially is what we're talking about here. The automated connections to run automations is super important, and customize those. And I think the next level is really those workflows, because there will be certain review processes that are at least have a manual component, a review control in some way, shape, or form, whether it's reviewing users, whether it's reviewing changes that are made, what have you. There's going to be an automated component of that in terms of producing or pulling a report, identifying what's changed. But the automation may not be able to, unless it's very prescriptive, determine what is appropriate or not. And that's where a human or several humans need to do that. And so being reminded to do that, and actually the workflow to get them to do that, is really a critical piece. And then I think that's also kind of back to the question before, what are some mistakes, companies make is maybe forgetting about or not appreciating that, right? Like, you cannot fully automate those things, nor should you want to, right? It's similar to AI. I mean, yes, there's a lot of really cool stuff technology can do and automate, However, there's a lot of really cool stuff that us humans should also still be doing too.
I love that point that you make there. And, you brought it back around to mistakes and to things that go wrong. And I want to pivot that question a little. And because, Bill, I want to give this one to you. Give us some examples of how continuous monitoring has really stop those problems from becoming into reality through like early detection of issues or potential risks. What are you seeing in your client base where there's actually been a business value that you can say, like, look, because we had continuous monitoring, we dodged this issue did not become a problem, this potential risk did not materialize?
Yeah. So I have a rather extreme example for that, actually, where a health tech SaaS firm that we work with, do SOC 2 and high trust, it actually ultimately helped identify unauthorized access before the cloud service provider did. So it told us a few things. Their alerting configuration on the cloud service platform was a little off. And I don't see this happening too often. If there's any time that a platform like this, in your defense in depth strategy can sort of skip layers, then it's a huge win. Where you can inform and get incident response in place, then I think that's a huge win. But more often than sort of that outlier example, I think it's more of identifying access anomalies and systems or workstations rather that are brought offline, so that you can ask about the areas of non-compliance rather than trying to sample for and look randomly for areas of non-compliance.
Got it. I love that example. That's a lot of fun. Bit extreme, like you say, where you're learning stuff before the CSP. Mark, Jason, any other examples of where we can say, we prevented a continuous monitoring really has a business value because this thing didn't happen?
Yeah, I'll jump on that. I mean, back to my comment earlier about failure rate. If you are testing and your system is alerting you to these failures and you cross that threshold, it's likely you either have a faulty control or a faulty test. Either way, it requires some attention. It could be an anomaly due to a unique external force, but you should document that too. So odds are there's something going on that you want to address now rather than wait until you're at audit time and having to scramble. So being able to address things in a timely manner as they're happening, rather than having a laundry list of things that you have to do in the run up to an audit, definitely makes you more efficient and makes you look better in front of the C-suite.
I'm sure it also makes for an easier audit.
Yes.
Far less painful. Jason, anything
Absolutely.
else that you can think of for examples?
I mean, I think Bill might have stolen the show there on that one. We certainly hear examples of clients that, terminations is a really hard nut to crack in terms of, communicating those and resolving those timely. And, whenever, historically you do testing and you find exceptions, you sort of like wonder why, why is the auditor finding this stuff out? So I see value there for sure. And I've seen some companies try and do continuous monitoring around that process. And that's also a control as well, right? But it's not being done for the audit. It's being done to ensure access is appropriate.
Fantastic. Well, I love those examples. And as we move to our third and final topic for today's presentation and panel, I want to remind our audience that if you have questions to ask our panel of experts, please do drop those in the chat. We will be taking those live for the next 15 minutes. And with that, we're going to start talking about planning for the future. And Mark, I want to kind of go back to you because you were talking about making audit prep more predictable and maybe a little more pleasant. And I want to ask, how can organizations really make sure that their documentation and records are audit ready at all times, not just like when you're preparing for the audit, but how you can make it continuously possible?
Well, depending on the automation, the right system will be pulling information in a standardized format. And if it's pulling it in a standardized format at a predictable frequency, well, then you've got something that's very deliverable to an external auditor, something that they can quickly understand and digest. beyond that, standard operating procedures, should require that standardization of documentation internally. So your control documents should all be standardized. But really, it comes down to that prep. If you've set it up correctly and you've got a system that is based on standardization, and you've got a system that's warning you of alerts along the way, then you really, if it's done in a frequency appropriate for the updates, then you shouldn't have any surprises when the audit actually happens. And when you present to the auditor, we were really happy this last time around. We brought our case to the auditor. We brought all of the documents that they requested, and compared to the prior system that we had used before we came to Hyperproof, they came back and had like very few questions. I mean, the follow-up was surprisingly short, and I credit that to that standardization.
It's always a great sign when you change audit firms and the new one asks you far less questions because you've been more thorough, as opposed to they themselves were not thorough. I'm glad that you had that success. Jason or Bill, anything else for making sure that your clients, like what are the recommendations you give to make sure that they're ready for as many audits as they're going to get throughout a calendar year?
Bill, feel free.
I was just going to say to practice the way you're going to play the game, right? You want to perform self-assessment checklists and totally own and manage the controls through your own, mini audit readiness type of procedures. And assuming, let's say this is your first audit, certainly going through some form of readiness assessment so that you know exactly what to expect, exactly how they're going to be testing the controls is absolutely recommended too.
Fantastic.
Absolutely. And I would, to add, excellent points. First, ensure that everyone really understands why you're doing what you're doing, and that this is really part of everyone's job and kind of essentially what's in it for everybody, beyond something you just have to do, right? Back to tying this to the company's objectives and supporting the objectives of growth and protecting the business and ensuring a really good kind of customer experience. And then really making sure that the stakeholders are identified, and that control owners actually not only know that they are a control owner, but what does that even mean? What are they expected to be doing on a regular basis, so that the documentation is ready. And whenever the audit comes, it comes, and that's sort of separate from what they should be doing or ensuring is done on a regular basis, depending on what their control responsibilities are. And I think also making sure that controls and audits are kind of part of the fabric. So even when a change happens at the organization, whether it's an organizational change or a process change, that the controls are a forethought, not an afterthought. Right. And so that's something we really talk to our clients about. Hey, when you're making a change, involve us in those conversations early so that the audit goes better. But even better than that is, you guys think about the control impact kind of first and then come to us, right? That would be even better.
I think that's a really good point there on being proactive and really working I like how you've got the narrative of just making it a normal business operation where everyone understands their role, and they've also practiced it really, as Bill suggested there, so that this is not an anomalous activity, but rather it's just a normal day at the office.
Yeah, and I think leveraging technology, looking in Hyperproof, looking at the dashboard on a regular basis is going to start really instilling that into the fabric of what everyone does every single day. And the fact that a lot of it is, basically saying, hey, buddy, look here, a lot of it's, it is that way, or, hey, you have to take this action. I think we'll start to, it takes time for things to become a habit, right? But that will help.
Fantastic. And I see we have an audience question, so I want to thank the audience for asking questions. Again, that's the green question mark in the upper right-hand corner if you've got a question for our panel. And this one is for our two auditors, and we're going to go with Bill first. So do auditors look for additional things if or when we're using continuous monitoring results to provide evidence? And if they dig deeper, how do they respond to it?
Great question from the audience member. And so first, I'll just say that the audit frameworks have not caught up with the technology that enables us to perform a lot of the automation and continuous monitoring that we're talking about here. So to a large extent, no, we don't treat it very differently as in terms of going deeper. Whereas we would love to, right? It'll ultimately provide a better product of assurance to all the constituents that are looking for that assurance. But right now, the deepest that we would go is as to the extent that the audit methodologies will allow us. When I think about depth, the only thing I would tie that back to that we do a little bit differently is getting that integrity check of any of the integrations and connections that you're performing as part of reliance on an automation platform. That's the only extra additional check where we would go.
Yeah, Bill, I think that's right. I also do think that the next iteration of at least the SOC 1 guy, which will probably come out early next year, will start to touch on this. To your point, the regulatory bodies, understandably sort of follow what happens and respond to what happens in the market. So, just to give an example, this is no different than an automation, right? So instead of a human doing something manually, we have a tool doing something, right? So instead of you going in and, or having someone go in and get a manual screen print of a setting, a config setting, right? There's an automated connection and that setting's always available, right? Okay, which is great. It saves time. The question is, well, how do I know that that's set up right? How do I know that's, correct? And so that's the integrity check you're talking about. So we do need to make sure that we're comfortable with whatever that software platform is and, who has access to it, what are the controls over it, because we are sort of solving a problem, if you will, in terms of time, and it's less effective to do things manually. At the same time, we are introducing some new risks, right, with the platform. And so we need to make sure we're comfortable. But that is, more of a kind of a one-time procedure.
I want Bill to respond to this one from you, Jason, because you're talking about really identifying potential audit issues before the audit kicks off, right? Like we're trying to figure out how do we make this a regular process. Bill, and then I'll go to Mark for this one, but Bill, how are you recommending organizations really address those potential audit issues before the audit kicks off?
Yeah, I mean, trying to close the gaps that were identified from the previous year is a good place to start. But beyond that, I think it all goes back to your own ownership management of your control set. So having some level of there shouldn't be surprises, let's just say, when it comes to the audit. And if there is, it is your own failure of the control operation, not the auditor. All too often there's a misconception when through adoption of a lot of the automation platforms that it's the auditor's job or the audit firm's responsibility to perform the monitoring, whereas that would be a conflict of interest right there. We can't own, operate, or manage controls. We can test them. We can advise on how to implement and operate them. But ultimately, it takes that ownership to how to do that. And we try to help folks understand how to best do that and give the best tools, techniques, and practices for that. But a lot of that just comes with your own understanding and ownership of your controls.
Right. How many controls have we seen where it says access to XYZ is appropriate? I'm like, well, that's not actually a control. If people test that, that's more of a substantive test. The control would be that the company's reviewing that access, right? So, yes, I'm trying to get companies away from that.
Absolutely. Mark, anything else here on making those audit issues go away before the audit kicks off?
Yeah, I think Bill's comment was spot on. I mean, reviewing your remediations from the last audit and so on, it makes sense. Clearly you should have a system that's showing you any issues that have come up along the way. You should have a management portal that lets you see and have somebody, paying attention to those, making sure that they're being addressed in a timely manner. So there shouldn't be any surprises. I would only add that there may be, expect the unexpected. If you are a business that's performing SOC 2 audits and you do 3 out of the 5 trust criteria, don't be surprised, or don't allow yourself to be surprised when all of a sudden senior management decides they're going to add a trust criteria at the last minute. You should be in those conversations ahead of time. You should make sure you're in the conversations so that you can be providing that input along the way and say, that's a great idea. If we do that, this is what's going to be required. So I would just add, potentially look for opportunities to inject yourself into the leadership conversations to ensure there's no surprises coming from that quadrant.
I think that's a great point. And because we're in the section talking about the future, I realize I think at the 40-minute mark in the recording, we brought up the topic of AI, but we really haven't talked about it. And goodness knows it's so popular these days. Mark, I want to go with you. Like, for companies that are considering leveraging AI for compliance purposes, any recommendations for where they should start?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that.
Oh boy.
No, in all honesty, my big concerns are less with the technology and more with the regulations. If you are going to go down that path, it may be right for your business. I would say start with ensuring that you're documenting everything. Go and engage a legal counsel if you can, and stay in touch with it, because we've seen, it wasn't that long ago, the EU passed their AI Act.
And it becomes law on August 1st of this year.
Exactly. So now we've got some black and white to guide us, right? Well, then, surprise, Colorado decides to pass their AI Act, and we're going to see this continue. We're going to continue to see, and so you need to stay on top of that. Back to my earlier comment about about regulatory changes, that's a risk that we need to manage. And so if you're going to start onboarding AI, bake that in to your decision-making process so that you can monitor it as you go, and ensure that if the regulatory goalposts move after you've implemented, that you have something to fall back on. Like I said, document everything, make sure that you can point to a good faith effort to comply, and that hopefully will go a long way to avoiding enforcement actions later.
And we all want to avoid those. Jason, Bill, you're probably seeing all kinds of interesting things from your clients about we could do singing, dancing AI for compliance, right? What are you seeing?
Yeah. Go
ahead, Jason.
Yeah. So, and ISO also has come out with a new framework, ISO 42001, in response to this as well. I don't anticipate another component for SOC 2 around that, fortunately. But I would say from the first kind of question has always been a lot of buzz around AI. And so, my question is, well, what does AI even mean to you? We're sort of so excited and scared about this thing at the same time. Well, what does it actually mean? What is it actually doing? And I do think about, in many ways, it is similar to automation, but of course, it depends on how it's actually being used. And so if it is being used in a control process, in addition to, or instead of a human actually doing some sort of analysis or review, then we need to understand how that works and how we can get comfortable with what the AI software is doing, and look at the controls around it. Who has access? What are the changes made to it? So that we can really embrace, the use of AI, from a controls perspective. I think it'll be some time though before we really see AI embraced in this process. And there's some folks that are kind of nervous about it. I think it's the unknown, but I don't know that it's any different than any other newer technology over the years as well.
Yeah, that's very fair. Bill, what are you recommending on AI about getting started for compliance purposes?
For compliance purposes, depending on where you are in your maturity of compliance, I'd largely tell you to ignore it at first, because it's going to introduce more confusion and risk into your environment than you're ready for. And there's so much that organizations can typically do without AI. As you get comfort with your program and with your compliance and control set, I think you can introduce it little by little based on the facets of AI that you really want to incorporate. As Jason said, you need to fully understand what components of AI you care about. Do you want the ML component? Do you want to incorporate different NLP aspects into your program to perform some of that for you? And the other thing is really understanding the market, because there are too many tools out there that say they're using it, and it's glorified automation.
Yeah.
And AI is very different, right? So understanding and being able to decipher the truth versus the naysayers is tough on its own.
That's fantastic. Well, I think we have to stop there, but I want to give everyone 30 seconds just to talk. Anything else you want to share with our audience today? Any observations from this chat as we move to close? We're just going to start with Mark first, and we'll go around my screen. So Mark, and then Jason, and then Bill.
Yeah, I am. Well, thank you for the opportunity. This has been a good discussion, and I appreciate all the input from all three of you guys. The only thing I would leave the audience with is the idea, or join a community. There's various communities out there where you can have conversations like this, and you can be part of the conversation too. And as long as you plug in, and as long as you keep learning, you'll be on the right path.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. Jason?
I mean, really well said. I would definitely echo that and say, make sure you're having continuous conversations and continually learning, and leverage and embrace, but also don't overcomplicate, and just really remember why we're doing what we're doing, what the value of compliance is, what the value of the technology is to drive compliance. It's never just one thing. It's a number of things working together and making sure that we're all learning and benefiting from one another's experience.
Fantastic. And Bill?
I would say to ensure that there's integration with your business, and that every step that you're taking in your compliance and your continuous monitoring journey should be with lockstep of your business objectives, and make sure that you're talking to your business and your executives in their language, which is the language of dollars and cents. Risk quantification and understanding all of that, I think, is a big part of talking that language and ultimately aligning your risk mitigation strategy appropriately.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Bill. And I want to thank our panelists for all of their thoughts and for their insights today. I want to thank our audience for taking some time out of your day to listen and to interact and for some of those great questions. And I'll say, if you're going to be at Black Hat 2024 in Las Vegas, melting with the rest of us in the summer heat of only 120 degrees, Hyperproof is sponsoring 2 happy hours. Alternatively, if you're going to be at ISACA GRC in Austin, Texas the week following, I am going to be on stage with my good friend Tom and a special guest drinking beer and talking about regulatory compliance, and you'll have a chance to drink a beer with us. I dread the opportunity to drink beer, but I'm doing it anyway. And finally, check us out at hyperproof.io on the web. And with that, I want to thank everyone. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.